And welcome to those that have just joined us. I'm here with Norm Baillie-David at TalentMap for our monthly webinar series. And today's topic is on selecting benchmark data for your employee engagement survey, specifically developing a baseline and comparing it with others. My name is Kelly Rigoli, and I'm a marketing coordinator here at TalentMap. And as you know, Norm Baillie-David, Senior Vice President of Consulting, with TalentMap, we'll be running through the content today and sharing some insight on this great topic. So our agenda for today is benchmarks in the context of employee engagement. We'll talk about benefits and value, pitfalls, and then different types of benchmarks. What is in a benchmark? Internal versus external, firm characteristics versus employee characteristics, and then of course the best types of comparison. Benchmark average and the top 10%. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have time for your questions. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. On the right-hand side there of your screen, there's going to be an area where you can submit questions. So we encourage you at any point to do that. We might have time in the middle, or else at the end for sure, we can answer your questions. As well, if you're looking to have a copy of the video of today's webinar, as well as the complete PowerPoint slide deck, we'll have it available to you in approximately 5 business days. So if you're on our mailing list, you should receive an email with the link to both of those. As well, you can also find it on our website, and we'll show you the link at the end of the slide deck as well. Okay, and just a quick overview of those of you who might not know us here at TalentMap. TalentMap has been around for over 15 years. We've conducted in excess of 7,000 employee engagement surveys since its inception. And that means that we're looking at 1 million plus employees surveyed since the beginning. And we run approximately 500 plus employee engagement surveys annually. So of course, our primary focus being employee engagement and measuring employee opinions. We also have a number of clients in various industries all across North America. We also have some international clients as well. If you look at our sectors, we range from technology, engineering, professional services, a large focus on health and sciences and financial services, and of course, various other sectors as well. And that being said, I'm going to turn it over now to Norm, and I'll be back at the end of the presentation and to cover a couple notes and questions before signing off. Okay, over to you, Norm.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever across the country you might be, whether it's Canada or the United States. Thank you very, very much for joining us here today. The topic of benchmarks, I mean, at first glance, it sounds pretty dry. It sounds like some pretty dry stuff, and I'm going to try to liven it up a little bit. I mean, the reason I wanted to do this particular webinar around benchmarks is because we get so many questions about what's the right benchmark for me? Do you have a benchmark on this industry or that industry? And oftentimes, especially when I'm presenting to senior leadership, the question of benchmarks arises very, very frequently. When we have a benchmark, who are we being compared to? Are those the right comparisons? And people tend to get hung up on all of these little issues, which actually, when you're doing an engagement survey, you're measuring engagement, are often besides the point. But what I want to show you today is really the power that benchmarks can have, especially in terms of how the data is interpreted. And of course, I want to give you some guidelines in terms of, what is the best benchmark to use and what's behind the scenes in the different benchmarks that you might come across over time. So before I even, what I'd like to do just to get this started, just to ask you a question. So you're going to see a poll that pops up in a second. And I want you to just ask the question here, do you compare your employee engagement survey results right now to any benchmark results? So just let's see who's using benchmarks now, what kind of benchmarks they might be. I don't know if you see this, but basically if you can see the results here, you'll see it's pretty split. So 3/4 of you who were on the line voted, and it's right down the middle. So 39% of you said, 41% said yes, 38% said no, and 22% are not sure. So that's really interesting. And so a lot of you are either not using benchmarks yet, or or not sure, maybe don't know, and maybe a little bit fewer than half are actually using the benchmarks themselves. So hopefully this will be a little bit interesting to you. You know, when you start off a topic like this, any topic, you start with a definition. And far from me to be pedantic, I think why I'm talking about the definition is really going to, it's going to fuel a lot of the argumentation that I'm going to make throughout the rest of the webinar. And so, essentially, what is a benchmark? Well, a benchmark is a point of reference. Easily said. Okay, we're going to be comparing our data to some sort of point of reference. Well, if you look at Merriam-Webster's definition, it's really interesting as well, because it says something that serves as a standard by which others may be measured or judged. So think about that definition for a second. If I'm going to be measured, if your senior leadership is going to be measured or judged by some other standard, well, all of a sudden now, our little benchmark here is now going to be very politically charged. Okay, and it's going to introduce a lot of those questions and that rancor and that concern that I talked about before, which basically is responsible for is the reason why people get so twisted in a knot around these benchmarks, because they feel that they're going to be measured or judged by that benchmark. So it's a good idea to understand exactly what we're getting into here. So obviously there are some benefits in terms of benchmarking, whether it's employee engagement or pretty much anything that we're trying to measure. It's a benchmark provides some context. Oftentimes when we don't have a benchmark, we don't always have a benchmark for everything. Some of our clients will do a completely custom survey, and so we don't have a benchmark because nobody else asked those questions. So the benchmark itself provides some context. So when you put that 75% engagement score, let's say, for argument's sake, that's 75% in front of an audience, and the first question somebody's going to ask is, well, is that good or is it not so good? Well, the benchmark provides the answer to that. It provides a frame of reference. It provides a context. So if a peer group, some other group of organizations similar to ours, have an 80%, then we're not so good. If that peer group has a 70%, then we feel pretty good. But interestingly enough, the benchmark also provides for another question that we get asked, well, what should we aim for in terms of our engagement? If we have 75% engagement this year, where should we realistically be heading? And of course, the benchmark can provide a realistic target. So if we're at 70%, and the benchmark's at 75% engagement, well, we can say, that's where your peers are. You might want to consider enacting strategies, developing strategies that will get you to that 75% mark, and then beyond. And then finally, the benchmark, really, I think this is the real important one of the three. It helps us focus on the real issues, not just ones where engagement is lower. So when you have a whole series of employee engagement results that are in front of you, and you have perceptions around things like professional growth and and performance feedback and compensation and all of the other dimensions, we'll often, just for example, see compensation being rated very, very, I won't say poorly, but usually it's at the bottom of people's lists of perceptions. They're always going to say that they're least happy with compensation. And without a benchmark, we would normally say, okay, well, you know what? That means we have to do something about people's perception around compensation. But when you put that in comparison to all of the other organizations in the benchmark, it shows you that, hey, you know what? Compensation, everybody's performing this poorly. But it's when we differ from the average, that's when we can focus on the real issues, not just the ones where the engagement is lower. But benchmarks aren't a panacea, and I think when a lot of organizations get into the measurement of employee engagement or pretty much everything else, they don't see the pitfalls. They see, okay, we need a benchmark, we need a comparison, we need to be able to compare with other organizations. When senior leadership insists on a benchmark, yada, yada, yada. And I want to focus a lot of today's discussion around the pitfalls, because there are pitfalls to benchmarking, and we need to understand these very, very well as we get into the selection of our benchmark, Not only the selection, however, also how we present our results in comparison to the benchmark. For example, the benchmark, and I'm going to give you, I'll show you a very, very stark example in a second. The benchmark has the potential to completely shift the decision-making and the strategic focus. Just the benchmark, even with the same results that we have, if you, depending on how that compares to a benchmark, it completely can shift the focus. So hold on to that thought, because I'm going to give you a demonstration of that in a second. And of course, there's also a pitfall: is how comparable is this benchmark to my organization right now? A little bit later on in the discussion, I'm going to start talking about, what kind of benchmark should we be comparing our organization to? And if the benchmark is not recognized as comparable, then there's going to be all kinds of questions as to, is that the right comparison, especially when you take into account the fact that this benchmark has so important potential to really change the decision that we're going to make as a result of the engagement results. So we need to be comfortable that our benchmark comparison is adequate, is fair. And the one that I see the most often, and hopefully while I'm dabbling on here, bantering on here, you have a chance to just read that Dilbert in the top bottom left-hand corner. And what we see very, very often, and it's unfortunate, but I have to say I see it quite a bit, is the benchmark itself is used to rationalize or accept mediocrity. And let me give you an example of that, and think about the first thing in terms of the decision-making apparatus and the strategic focus. So here's an example of an organization's results. And essentially you can see here, when you're looking at the senior leadership dimension, you see the percentage of folks that are agreeing or strongly agreeing in green, and in neither agree nor disagree in blue, or disagreeing or strongly disagreeing in orange. And think for a minute, just think for a minute. If you were the senior leader of this particular organization, how would you react to this? So essentially, if you're like most people, without any other context, you would say, you know what, it's okay, but really we should be doing a little bit better. We should have more people with a better perception of senior leadership. That would be my take without seeing anything else. And when you show this to a leadership team, that would probably be their take as well. I mean, you can comment in the questions box or ask me a question a little later and differ with that, but just take that at face value. And then now let's put that, I'm going to show you the comparison to some real benchmarks. Three in particular, one for the academic sector, one for the general public sector, and one for the large organizations. And all of a sudden, now how do you interpret this data? Now when you look at this and you see, hey, you know what, 63%, well, we're 16% higher than the benchmark. The pluses indicate that we're over the benchmark. We're doing great, aren't we? And so obviously now you can see what I'm talking about in terms of the impact of that benchmark. See how that, just the showing of the benchmark, completely shifts the decision-making and the strategic focus. So now, where a senior leader here before you see the benchmark might be an issue we want to tackle, once the benchmark is in place, all incentive to doing something about this, especially amongst the senior leadership team, now we feel pretty good about ourselves and senior leadership. So we're not going to take action, even though that might be a pretty mediocre result, and that's exactly what you see here. Often used to rationalize and accept mediocrity. Just showing the benchmark, nothing more, is having that impact on it. So you can see, hopefully this example shows you the power of the benchmark itself. So as we go on here, let's get into different types of benchmark. So there's really two, and I think this is pretty evident. There's a comparison. You have an internal benchmark and you have an external benchmark. I'm not going to spend much time on the internal side. There's one message I want to really get across. I think most of us are thinking about external benchmarks when we're thinking about benchmarking, but there are also internal ones. So within internal to the organization, we can have two types. We can have the comparison of our group, our division, our department, our functional group to the overall organization. So that's one basis for comparison. And we can also compare our results to our same results in a previous period. So there's two comparisons there. And what I want to show you is essentially when we compare a functional group, a department, to the organization average. So this is a very, very common internal benchmark. And it's very useful. What you're looking at here is what we call our heat map. And our heat map, what it does is it shows you the overall favorability, so the percentage of individuals who are favorable on each of these dimensions, compensation, work environment, a number of questions. So on average, 58% of company A here are favorable towards compensation, and then it looks at the different departments. And so it can be quite useful if you're sitting in the right chair to look at which departments are above average in green, which below average in orange, and of course the more we go below average, the more deeper or above average, the deeper the color is going to get. So it's a very visual chart. Now, the message here is not that the benchmark, the comparison is not something that we should do. Absolutely, we should do it, and organizations would benefit from it. It's how it gets presented. So when you put a chart like this up, and I think be very cognizant of it, yes, you want to be transparent. You want to show the individuals their accurate results, but it's a question of how. So essentially, if you can imagine your senior leadership team sitting around the boardroom table, and you got the vice president of each of these departments, department 1 through 6, sitting around the table. Now, it's fine and good to say, okay, here, folks, this is how these are our engagement results, 81%, so that's pretty good. And here it is by department. So we're getting into a little bit more analysis, very good. But what you have to take into account, and this is the caveat to doing this, it's not the benchmark and the comparison is a bad one to make, absolutely not. However, there is a psychological impact in terms of how people receive these results in an open forum. So if I'm sitting next to, I'm VP Department 2, or let's say I'm VP Department 4, and sitting next to me is Kelly, who's the VP of Department 3, and these results go up. Now remember that definition that we talked about, a standard by which something is measured or judged. So now if I'm VP Department 4, you know what? I'm 9% above the organization's average. I'm feeling pretty good about myself sitting around that table right now. If poor Kelly is the VP of Department 3, she's sort of slinking under the table at this particular juncture. And not that she's unaware of what's going on in her department and that some of her people are less than enthused, less than engaged. But to be shown this amongst her peers can be quite damaging. And what will normally happen, normally transpire, is you'll have the worst of both worlds that takes place. So me being the VP Department 4, I'm saying, hey, engagement's not my problem. I'm doing fine. And I've checked out now. I'm gone on to other priorities. I'm not going to worry about employee engagement. Very destructive behavior. Of course, and Kelly is sitting there, and Kelly is saying, you know what? There's got to be something wrong with these results because I have to protect myself. I'm losing face in front of my peers. So I'm going to challenge. And so neither party, positive or negative, is really going to take a constructive approach to engagement. Now, had we been approached individually about this, not being shown that in a public forum, it would have been a very, very different result. So that's really how we have to be careful in terms of how we present some of these averages. So essentially, I've gone through some of what those pros and cons could be. You want to know, you want to be able to set a bar, you want to be able to see how you compare, but at the same time, there can be very nefarious consequences if we lose face, or if we provide the opportunity for somebody to lose face in front of their peers. Comparison to previous period, I think it's pretty self-evident what the pros and the cons are. I tend to say, you know, when people get caught up in their own, you know, in all of the rancor around, is this the right benchmark? Is that the right benchmark? Or, you know, that kind of thing. The best benchmark is your own. Is basically your best comparator is yourself. The previous period amongst all the benchmarks that we're going to be talking about is probably the most relevant and probably your best comparator. you're comparing to yourself. No organization or group of organizations is going to have this exactly the same condition. If you're doing this for the first time, you don't have this benefit, obviously. But if you're not, the previous period, your last survey is going to be your best benchmark of all the benchmarks that we can look at. So now we get into the external benchmarks. And essentially, there's three types of benchmarks here. There's a lot of different ones, but it usually boils down to one of three: the size, your sector, or your region. And so if I ask you, which of these characteristics, and now I'm going to put it in your shoes, I want you to tell me, which do you think of these three characteristics, or is it something else, that best explains the differences in terms of employee engagement? All right, so we've got here 41% of you say it's industry, 35% of you say it's the size of the organization, 22% of you say it's something else, and only 3% of you say it's region or geography. The actual right answer to that is the 35% of you who said size of organization. And this is a common mistake or misnomer, because we tend, and I don't blame you, absolutely don't blame you. It's what I would have thought before I got into this subject matter more specifically. We tend to think that companies or organizations doing the same thing that we do, i.e. in our industry, in our business, are going to be the most similar. But in actual fact, because I'll show you some of the characteristics of our own benchmark data. In actual fact, it's not the industry, and it's certainly not where our organization is located. We have a map of Canada here. We could have equally put a map of the U.S. Or both North America. It doesn't really matter where we are within North America, although in the other regions of the world it certainly does. But within North America, it really doesn't matter. And the industry, we tend to want to compare organizations that are similar to ourselves. But where we don't see much difference, or we can see very, very big differences in terms of industry sector. Where we see the biggest differences are size of organization. It really is size that matters in this particular subject matter. In terms of industry, it doesn't really matter whether or not I'm in high tech, or I'm in law, or I'm in, there's a couple of exceptions that I'll talk about in a second. But if I'm in manufacturing, or if I'm in transportation, or many other sectors, the industry itself is not going to make a big difference, but the size will. So if I'm comparing to organizations of roughly my size, it's a much better comparator than if I'm comparing to other organizations in my industry. Why? Well, because it really doesn't matter what widgets we're producing or what services we're providing. Employee engagement is a function of how people interrelate with each other, how people are managed, and how people manage. And that is constant across many, many industries. Now, there are exceptions, and I'm sure you're going to challenge me on that. There are exceptions, and absolutely, we recognize those exceptions, and we have created benchmarks for those exceptions. And those exceptions tend to be healthcare, a very, very different sector. Public sector, very, very different than the private sector. Why? Well, because the public sector has a lot of rules-based HR policies that are going to impact the level of engagement. But within private sector types of industries, you don't tend to have these, and it really is size dependent. And of course, geography, really no difference. We don't see any differences between a similar size organization in Alberta versus Ontario versus Quebec versus Yukon versus BC versus Florida, California, or Nebraska. So it really is the size. So the first thing we should be looking at here is the size of the organization. So, the question begs, which one's most suited to your organization? And so, to answer that question, these are the questions that you should be asking in terms of, what's right for you. And I think they're probably not what you expect. So, the first question, first and foremost, is what's available for my survey provider? Why would I ask that? Well, because the benchmarks are not, these are not public statistics. This doesn't come from Statistics Canada or U.S. Department of Labor or Statistics or any other publicly based or industry-wide organization. Benchmarks come from the employee engagement survey industry. So we as a vendor collect data and we use that as benchmarks, and so do our competitors. So the first and most important question that you have to ask is, what can I get? What have you got? What does your benchmark look like? What is available? Because TalentMap is not going to survey the same clients as our competitors are. We're each going to have our, there's going to be overlap for sure, but we're never going to survey the same clients. We might have similar industry profiles. You saw a sample, a very small sample of our clients. It cuts across industries. But each and every organization is going to differ from that matter. For example, TalentMap is very, very strong in North America. So our benchmark, we do almost our entire business base here in North America, probably equally based Canada, US. So other organizations are more global in nature. So when you get to looking at a North American benchmark, they may or may not have the same level of robustness. So that's the first question that you've got to ask for. And the next question really relates to what we just asked in the poll, which is which characteristic is really best at accounting for differences in employee engagement. And don't say, don't caveat that, say, within my industry, because it really doesn't matter within your industry, unless you're in healthcare or public sector, right? So is it the size? Is it the industry? Is it the region? Is it something else, right? But the two most important questions that you should be looking at in terms of evaluating your benchmark, think about it for a second, ladies and gentlemen. What you're trying to do in terms of comparing your employee engagement is you're ultimately trying to improve and increase the number of people in your organization who are engaged. Why? Well, because A, you want to retain them, B, you want them to be more productive, C, you want them to be happier, and D, ultimately you want to use a strong level of engagement in your organization to recruit talent. And of course, as talent becomes more and more scarce in the coming years, at least in North America it will, maybe not Asia, but certainly North America, what we need to be looking at is, where does my talent come from? And where does the talent go to when they leave? So this actually might differ within different functions of my organization. But fundamentally, and this could now introduce a geographic component, even though geography isn't really going to explain much of engagement at all. But we need to understand where our talent is going to come from, and where does it go when they leave. So where are we losing our talent to? Who's doing a better job at engagement than we are, and why are we losing it to them? And so some sectors tend to be very insular in that perspective. And in that case, you might make a case for a specific industry. For example, let's take law, at least the professional side of law or accounting. Accounting not so much, but law, lawyers are going to go from law firm to law firm, so it might make sense to compare yourself to other law firms if the provider has that data. So that's one example. But other than that, you have a lot of individuals that might necessarily stay within their industry. And if I'm not talking about management, I'm talking about HR professionals, if I'm talking about accounting finance professionals, if I'm talking about a lot of different engineers, et cetera, they can go from industry to industry with their body of knowledge. So it really doesn't matter. What we need to understand where they've come from, where do we recruit them from, and where do they go when they leave. So now what I want to do essentially is I want to open our kimono a little bit, and to give you, if you need to ask the question, what is available from my survey provider in order to, to assess a benchmark, then you need to understand a little bit about what goes into these things. And so, we sort of jokingly say, okay, well, it's all a bunch of smoke and mirrors. How do the consultants create these benchmarks? Well, I can only speak for TalentMap. So I'm going to open our Kimono a little bit, and I'm going to tell you how we create our benchmarks. So what we do is essentially, if we're going to create a benchmark from scratch. So, for example, if we're in the midst now of we're in the midst of finalizing a benchmark for municipalities. So it has to meet a number of criteria before we can have enough robustness, enough different companies or different organizations or different municipalities in this benchmark. So there's a number of things we need to look at. Minimum number of unique organizations. We need to have at least 6. We like to have, that's a minimum. We like to have at least 10 to 12. So the minimum is 6. Once we get around 10 to 12 different organizations, then we start to get a little bit more comfortable that we can use this as a benchmark. Time frame, previous 5 years. So you don't want an organization that's been around for 50 years saying, yes, we have 300 companies in our benchmark. Well, when was the company survey done? You might have a company in that benchmark that was done in 1974. How useful is that, right? So what we do at TalentMap is we roll over our benchmark every 5 years. So our benchmarks in 2017 only contain survey data that was conducted since 2012, March 2012, to be precise. And so we roll that over. We're not going to change our benchmark every month. We're going to do it every year. So we roll that over and check. You got to ask, how old is your benchmark? What's the longest a company can be in that benchmark? There's a discussion around whether or not repeat projects are included. So I had the question asked to me yesterday by a client saying, if in your benchmark, could the same organization be in there twice? And the answer to that is yes, if they surveyed twice within the last 5 years. And they said, well, what about 3 times? I said, theoretically, yes, but there's very, very few organizations that survey 3 times within 5 years. We only recommend you doing it once every 2 years, so that would exclude the 3 times every 5 years. So repeat projects are included. And then they say, well, aren't we then comparing to organizations where engagement is increasing as they continue? It's absolutely not, because you have just as many organizations where engagement has gone down from survey to survey as it's gone up. As a matter of fact, it's split around 50-50. So it evens itself out. And then performance. We basically look at the top 10% or the top quartile. That's one way we can look at a different specific benchmark, apart from industry, apart from size, apart from organization, and then you got something that I haven't mentioned before. Up to now, I've been talking exclusively about other organizations, external benchmarks primarily, although we mentioned internal. But there's 2 dimensions to a benchmark. The first is, who's in the basket and what's the composition of that basket. But probably more importantly and less often entering the discussion is, can we compare the question that we're asking with the benchmark question? Because many organizations, some are very satisfied with the standard questioning that you will receive from our supplier, TalentMap, another supplier, whomever, but an equal number of organizations want to customize their questions. And some are similar. You would expect you're going to have some similarity in questions, even though there's a little bit of wording change. So at what point can we say, yes, you can compare this question, or no, you cannot compare that question? So I'm going to flash through a couple of slides. As Kelly said before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. You'll have this when you download the presentation and or the recording, you'll see all of this data. But you can see how we lay out, for example, our overall benchmark. And so our overall benchmark, you can see there's 161 organizations in there, 272 projects, about 130,000 respondents, anywhere between 8 and 8,000 people in each client, for example. Actually now that number is over 10,000, for example. You can see there's a large range of different organizations in there. You can see some statistics on, in terms of the median is around 72%. The median, so half of organizations have fewer than 72% engaged, the other half more. The top 10%, about 84%, the maximum 95%, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of data here. You can, when you get a chance to go through this, you'll be able to do a little bit more of your analysis here in terms of what's available. So you can see some of the benchmarks that we provide, and you can see some of the things. For example, Western Canada, many organizations in the West, or some, I won't say many, insist on having a benchmark, particularly for Western Canada-based organizations, under the misguided assumption that they're different. We know they're not. But in order to make sure that client feels comfortable comparing themselves to another basket of organizations, and that's really what it's all about, folks. You need to be comfortable with this. Then yeah, so we'll provide one. And there's here, and there's some others as well. Municipal I mentioned as well. So you can see that. I'm not going to run through all of these stats. You can see that when you download the presentation. Now what I want to do a little bit of quiz here. So remember, I'm going to come back to the question comparability. So let's look at a couple of questions, and you tell me, folks, if the questions you believe are comparable enough to in order to use a benchmark. So on one hand, you see there's a clear, one question asks, I can see a clear link between my work and my organization's long-term objectives. And on the other hand, the client wants to ask, I understand how my work directly contributes to the overall success of client or my organization. Are these questions comparable enough, do you think, to compare the benchmark? Roughly, well, not roughly, 45% of those who you voted said yes, they're comparable enough. 55% said no. And there is no right or wrong answer here, ladies and gentlemen, but we have to make a call at some point. So I can tell you, if I'm looking at these two questions, what am I looking at? What you're trying to assess is, does the attitude express the concept similar enough so that we can use, so it's essentially the same concept being measured. So if we look at these two questions, I see a clear link between my work and my organization's long-term objectives. So what we're trying to see is how my individual role, what my individual role does, and do I see that link between that and the direction of the client? And on the right-hand side, I understand how my work directly contributes to the overall success of the client. So although it's not an exact comparison, my penchant would be, yeah, this is close enough. Why? Well, because both are measuring the concept of the level of contribution to the organization's success or long-term objectives. And it's the word contribute really there that, for me, when I look at those two questions, of course, you may differ with me, and that's fine. I'm hoping that this exercise just gets you to ask the question. So once I see the fundamental concept being the contribution to the long-term success or objectives being measured in both, I'd say that's close enough. Okay? And so now we'll give you another chance here. So two questions. My immediate supervisor gives me constructive feedback on the work I do, and my manager provides regular feedback about my work. Comparable or not? So essentially, 61% of you say that is comparable, 39% said no. Unfortunately, folks, I'll take my vote is for yes. For no on this particular one. And the reason I'm saying that these two are not comparable is when I look at the two and I see one says constructive feedback and the other says regular feedback. So what we're trying to measure is, one is the quality of feedback and the other is the frequency of feedback. And for that reason, I would not compare these two results. So I would differ with most of you on this particular one. So this was a little bit of fun. And hopefully what we're doing here is we're giving you some tools. I'm giving you some tools to look at these questions very, very critically before you start to use benchmark data that might be available. Because even if the basket of organizations is good, is comparable, is similar, and you're comfortable with it, if you don't have a question that's very similar, then essentially what that basically, it renders the entire exercise a little bit useless. So, all right. So I think that's it. I'm just about done anyway, so I'm hoping you see a mirror in front of you. And what the mirror fallacy is meant to talk about is, and I'm sure you've seen this yourself, the mirror fallacy is the penchant for especially leadership, especially senior leaders in organizations, to try to craft a benchmark that looks so much like yourselves that is pretty impossible. And when you understand, A, how benchmarks are developed and crafted, and B, what's important in a benchmark, usually not the business or the industry, then you can see that that is a fallacy itself. So, you know, when you're looking at a basket of organizations, the questions that you should be asking is essentially how, again, it comes back to the talent. So where's my talent coming from? Where's it going through? It doesn't have to be a mirror image of your organization. As a matter of fact, the only mirror image that's valid here is your own previous period result. That's your mirror image. So when you look at a benchmark in and of itself, then don't get caught up with trying to match all of the characteristics of your organization, because fundamentally, that's really not what's going to drive engagement. So I have some final thoughts here. And essentially what that is, essentially, you know, when you're looking at benchmarks, they can be very useful. But the benchmark should never be an excuse for inaction. You can see, or you've seen how benchmarks can rationalize or be used to rationalize mediocrity. So we should never look at a benchmark and say, okay, we're good. You know, we don't need to act because we're above benchmark on this. We need to look at our own results and always keep in mind continuous improvement. The reliable benchmark, what's a good benchmark for me? It needs to have as many organizations as possible. It also needs to be pretty recent. The more recent, the better, but of course you need numbers in there as well. So less than 5 years is going to be hard. And of course, finally, don't try to mirror yourself in your own benchmark. Use your previous period results to do that. So at this point, I'm getting some messaging here that the slides doesn't look like that they are they're following, and the poll seems to have mucked that up a little bit. So as I go to the questions box, I'm going to ask Kelly to jump back in and talk about our upcoming learning sessions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Norm. So I'll talk a little bit. I know you probably can't see the slide, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the presentations and also trade shows that we have coming up. We're going to be at the HRIA in Edmonton coming up in May, and we're very excited about that. And sorry, that's in April. And we're going to be having Sean speaking on from employee engagement to employee experience at that event. We're also going to be at the HRMA conference. They're now called CPBC as well as Yukon. So that's going to be in BC. And again, Sean will be speaking on from employee engagement to employee experience. And that's going to be an HR conference and trade show. And then we have some other exciting opportunities happening in New York at the New York Tech Summit. And we also have another one coming up in for Colorado SHRM. So we're very excited about those events, and we hope to see you at some of them as well. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask about any of the things we talked about earlier, and we can answer those questions now. And let's see here if we have any questions.
Yes, we do. We've got a couple of questions here. So the first question is, are you able to use previous year data from another vendor as an internal benchmark? The question is really absolutely. It's really a question of the comparability. So if you use a different vendor, but you're asking the same question, then absolutely you can use that previous period data, and we often do that as well. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to thank you very, very much for your attendance, for your patience. If you haven't been able to see all of the different slides, we will post the full presentation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention. Everybody have a wonderful day.